Welcome to our 9-lesson series called Pulling G's, where we'll study fighter pilot perspectives on faith. My name is Hugh Vest, my call sign is Huge, and I'm a retired fighter pilot with over 4,000 hours. I'll be your guide or your instructor pilot for this journey. So strap inside a $40 million F-16 Viper and come with me for an insider's look at the tactics, training, and technology behind 21st century aerial combat. This study will take a warrior's perspective on faith that'll hopefully inspire you in spiritual combat with the same things, the same tools that make for a leading-edge fighter pilot. Each chapter in this series will start with real cockpit insights, and from there we'll move on to everyday life faith applications, and we'll end with debrief questions for you or your group to look at. So some things we'll talk about is we'll debrief your life's mission like a fighter pilot. We'll strain on the G-forces of this world. We'll study the tactics of our adversary. We'll learn to trust our instrument in faith. We'll also learn to know our -1 checklist for life. We'll see through the black world using our Creator's night vision goggles. We'll explore the call signs of God. And then we'll also look at hangar flying lessons in faith from some of the pioneers out there. So again, as fighter pilots would say, fights on. So before we get into the series and are in chapter 1 and press on with all the other chapters, I'd like to do what we call some administrative details, or admin as fighter pilots call it. So a couple things. First thing is I'd like it, if you get a chance, to take a look at the book, Pulling G's, Fighter Pilot Perspectives in Faith. And I'm the author, Hugh Vest. And this book actually has more chapters in it. It has all the lessons in it, but additional details. And then the good thing is it's also a short read. So I just encourage you to pick it up. It's available on crosslinkpublishing.com. Or if you want to talk to your local Christian bookstore, it's available through the Ingram Distribution Network. And so I'd like to encourage you there to pick up the book if you can. A couple other things is I'd like to thank the Air Force for the chance to do this. And they actually were able to review the material in the book, in which I'll be presenting here, and then found that it's within Air Force policy. And I do have to remind you that none of the views that I'll talk about here represent the Department of Defense or the United States Air Force. So I have to offer that disclaimer. And additionally, there is no classified or sensitive data in any of these. And then finally, I'd like to thank YouTube for giving me this free opportunity to pass on these lessons to you, for you to look at and hopefully enjoy and join me in this journey. So again, welcome. Join me in this journey, and we'll get into chapter 1 and following on chapters here. So fights on. Welcome to Chapter 6 of the Pulling G's video series. If this is your first chapter you're looking at, I'd encourage you to check out chapters 1 through 5 first before jumping into Chapter 6. But if you're jumping into Chapter 6, welcome. So the subject today is going to be the best office in the world. And so we'll be talking about that today. The key verse is out of the book of First Chronicles, back in the Old Testament. So the book of First Chronicles in our fighter pilots flight manual for life, which is the Holy Bible. So book of First Chronicles 16:29. And that verse says, "Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness." So I'd like to just kind of kick things off and talk about the best office in the world. They're always having contests about the best office, whether it's an architectural design kind of contest, something from a business, even like environmental circles where they try to determine the best environmental office space or office workspace. And so this is back in 2011, but Steve Jobs built this spaceship-like campus for Apple employees and their new plans. And this is what they said about it. They said the site for the curvaceous four-story human-scale building to house 13,000 employees is the original home of HP's Computer Systems division, land that was recently sold to Apple. Steve Jobs claims that the new curved glass facility will be the best office building in the world, luring students of architecture anxious for a peek. Apple plans to break ground in 2012 with a 2015 move-in date. This is obviously dated a little bit, so they've already moved into Steve Jobs' future masterpiece. So that's possibly, I've never seen it, but possibly the best office in the world, one of the candidates. Another one that comes to mind when you think of the best office in the world is the Oval Office, obviously the office of the President of the United States. And I don't think any other office can compete with prestige and the raw power of this simple office. It's actually a very simple office from the pictures I've seen. Here's a description of it. It says the room features 3 large south-facing windows behind the president's desk and a fireplace at the north end. It has 4 doors. The east door remains open to the rose garden. The west door leads to a private, smaller study and a dining room. And the northwest door opens into the main corridor of the west wing. And the northeast door opens to the office of the president's secretary. And so, that's definitely a prime candidate just based on the history, the raw power that goes on in that office. So that's obviously one of the candidates for the best office of the world. And so, when I think about these offices, whether it's, Steve Jobs' masterpiece or the Oval Office or some other office that's just awesome, the corner office in a massive skyscraper or whatever. I just wonder if any of the folks working there actually get to sit back and just enjoy the space. Are they so busy and so wrapped up in everything they're doing that they can't sit back and actually go look out the window and go, man, I'm in the best office in the world? So does the President of the United States, that's something interesting, does the President of the United States actually just sit back in his desk every once in a while and go, man, I'm in the best office of the world, in the world? So I'd like to offer up another candidate for the best office of the world. And this is the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. The office being an F-16 in flight. And I've heard, a lot of guys have claimed, hey, this is the best office in the world. And so any modern cockpit is probably a good candidate. For the F-16, it has basically the canopy kind of wraps around the pilot. There's not a lot of space in there. There's no rails, canopy rails obstructing your view. You have a heads-up display. You have 2 multi-function displays. And there's just a couple instruments, and you can actually see your knees, and it looks like you're basically sitting on top of a rocket poised out in space. Let me tell you, it's kind of one cool ride and one cool view. And so I thought I'd just I'll show you a picture real quick of what it looks like, kind of a preview of what my probably vote for the best office in the world is. So, what do you think? Does that win the award as the best office in the world? Well, a couple things to think about in that is, a lot of people ask, what the view is like. Is it awesome? What do you see flying fighters? And one thing I can definitely say is that there's a lot to see, but you're usually too busy to see it. So there almost is a direct correlation between the quality of what you have to see outside and then how busy you are inside, and with all the tasks of being a fighter pilot to actually not be able to enjoy the view. So there's very little time that we had to just look outside. And usually if you're just looking outside and enjoying the view, something probably was wrong. If you're looking outside, you're clearing for traffic, you're looking for all kinds of other things. There's so many different tasks you're doing, monitoring the radar. If you're down low, you're trying not to hit the ground, getting the mission done, thinking about how the mission was changing, knowing where people were. So, again, there's a lot to see, but the bottom line is you're usually too busy to notice it. And so that office probably isn't that much different than some of the other offices where you're in a great office, but you probably just don't get a lot of time to look out the window. And so, in flying fighters, I just got maybe brief glimpses of the wonders that are out there that went by that cockpit as you're flying. So I thought I'd just tell you a story about one of them. When back the first time I deployed to the desert, we were the first F-16 squadron in the Air Force to take on the mission. We were taking on the mission flying with the new harm targeting system, and we'd become officially Wild Weasels as an F-16 squadron and taking on that mission. And that mission actually, as a Wild Weasel, what you did is you would fly. It was kind of a cat and mouse game with surface to air missile sights, where you'd fly and you'd try to get them to target you, and when they targeted you, you would actually could target them back, while at the same time trying to avoid any shots they were taking at you. And we had a thing called a harm missile that we would use to target them. So it was kind of like a cat and mouse game we played with them. But anyways, we were getting ready to deploy as one of the first F-16 squadrons to pick up that mission full time from the F-4s to the desert. And so for that deployment for the desert, it was a long flight. And so what usually you do for those long flights, we'd be out over the North Atlantic. So we wore these thick rubber anti-exposure suits called poopy suits. So I don't really know the full story where they got that name, but probably won't go into that here. But anyways, they're called poopy suits, and we wear those. So we'd have a lot of thick clothing that we'd wear, and this poopy suit. We'd have a low residue meal to take in the cockpit, and you'd be in a pretty small confined space for 9 to 10 hours or possibly more, crossing the ocean. So it was a big deal. Also, the F-16 only had one engine, so it was a little bit of a dicey game there, crossing the North Atlantic with one engine, realizing, hey, if something was wrong with that engine, that poopy suit would give you maybe about 15 minutes in the North Atlantic. Would be about all you'd have. So it was a little bit of a tense situation in some aspects if you thought through kind of some what ifs that could happen. But anyways, we went through all of our pre-departure briefings and things, and we loaded up for the flight, and we took off pretty much into the black of night on that deployment. And at this particular time, we took off from the East Coast, and it was just raining. So we took off into the black at night. This is before we had night vision goggles, into this thick rain. And so we followed each other out on radar in our aircraft. And so we finally joined up with the tanker. And so what you usually do is you join up with tankers on your trip across the pond, they call it. And then what you do is refuel on the way. And so you just hang out on the wing of the tanker and you fly at tanker speeds, kind of airliner speeds across the water. And this was so you kept enough divert fuel if something happened, you could actually to the tanker, you couldn't refuel, you could actually now turn around and go back or land at one of the divert locations on the way. So we took off into this thick of night, raining. We joined up with the tanker, and it was so dark, and the weather was so bad. We kind of had to inch our way up along the tanker in that thick goo to pretty much find the boom and refuel each time. So it was pretty tense, flying at night for hours doing that. And so we usually, for this particular mission, we refueled approximately 9 times on the way over there. So you just kind of count the time by thinking about my next refueling. Okay, I got about an hour till my next refueling or so. And so you just hang out and check your gauges and those kinds of things. But this was a really nasty, dark night. And we were just tired already from taking off in the middle of the night and hanging with this tanker, watching all this in this weather. We couldn't see anything. And then finally, kind of like the opening of a door, suddenly we just broke out of all the clouds and all the weather into this beautiful night sky. And then the first thing we saw when we broke out into this night, this formation of all these F-16s and these tankers, was the Aurora Borealis, or the Northern Lights is what they're called. And so we could see reds and greens and all these this canopy of wonders in front of us just from that particular deployment. So it's just awesome. So, even though, we were laboring, refueling and flying in the weather visually and trying to hang on, we just got this momentary reprieve where we broke out and we actually took, from the best office of the world, we actually took a chance to God gave us a chance to see something wonderful. So anyways, I'd like to show you just a couple pictures of what that looks like. So as Christians, do we find ourselves trudging along in our cubicle with the best office view in the world just sitting right next to us? And are we oblivious to that? Are we refueling and worried about the flights and in the dark of night when we could just be seeing the quick glimpse of the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights? So as Christians, we want that. And I think God wants us to take time out to just enjoy the view, right? And I know if we do, He'll show us something wonderful. And so the official biblical term for taking a time out like this is called worship. And so I don't want to get too much into theology on worship, and I don't want to interfere with a lot of your beliefs on worship. But I just thought we'd discuss worship in a few more details and maybe just or take some time out to think about this idea of worship. So worship itself is kind of a natural response to God based on who He is and what He has done for us. So it's our natural response to God. It's also an attitude check for us in taking a time out from the supposedly important business of life. And so God craves our time with Him, I think. I think God enjoys that time. And when I think about worship, probably the idea is how do we do worship? How do we translate worship into practical terms? How do we take worship to the tactical level, the nuts and bolts? And what are the nuts and bolts of kind of true worship? And I think the God's flight manual for life, the Holy Bible, has lots of examples. If we just look in there, it's just chock full of examples of worship and tactical examples of how to worship. And so I thought we'd just take kind of a quick survey of those and explore the idea of worship a little bit. The first, not necessarily the first time of worship, but one of the first examples I can think of is in the book of Exodus. Chapter 3, 5 through 6. And this is Moses, the famous Moses who parted the sea and led the Israelites out of captivity from Egypt and led them into the promised land. And that Moses, well, he encounters God in a burning bush, and Moses' response to God at that point is one of the first kind of acts of worship when we think about it. And here's the actual verse. God says to Moses, he says, "Moses, Moses, take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Early worship and worship today can involve movements just like Moses, where we do things like bow, we kneel, we are in silence, we raise our hands, we take off our dusty sandals, we give God our best attire, we may keep our head covered or remove other headgear, or those kinds of things, or close our eyes or avert our eyes even. So these kinds of responses that Moses had are acts of worship, and there's things that we can do like that. Of course, there's other examples too. In the Bible book of Exodus, God also establishes some rituals for the Israelites for worship. He establishes festivals for worship, covenants of worship, an ark, tabernacle, offerings, a tribe of priests, and he actually established a place for worship here for the Israelites. And this is something too we often have for worship, which we call a church, for the church building, a place to worship. And so, Christ, when he came, established a new covenant and a new church. And so his church actually even became more than just this building and things. It became a body of believers. And his covenant and faith wasn't restricted by some of these laws, rituals, obedience, and service, although these are things we can do to worship the Lord. And I think even back in the old days, post Moses, but before the time of Christ, King David really has a lot. We have a lot to learn, I think, and I have a lot to learn from King David on how to worship. And so he, the Bible in the 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, God called David a man after his own heart, because David knew how to worship. And so David, King David worshiped in all kinds of ways. He sang and composed songs, endless songs of praise to the Lord, which are called the Psalms. There's actually a whole book of Psalms. In 2 Samuel 6:5, it said David and his folks were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with songs and harps and lyres and tambourines and sistrums and cymbals. And in 2 Samuel 6:16, it says David leaped and danced before the Lord. So David did these things, songs and dance and music, and David cried out to the Lord sometimes in frustration and fear. When he was told his child would die in 2 Samuel, he pleaded with God. He fasted and spent nights lying on the ground. So David also wrote poetry and ballads to the Lord. And so here's one of them in Psalms 139, 7 through 10. He says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, and even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. So David lived kind of a life basically out loud in worship of God. And David's son, King Solomon, kind of even expanded this. He worshiped God with his mind and reason. And he wrote incredible books of wisdom. And one of them the book of Ecclesiastes, where he's worshiping God with his mind. And in chapter 3, 11 and 12, and 13, he explores all the wisdom of men and writes, He has made everything beautiful in its time, God has. God has set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. And so as we explore worship even further, the early church, so this is jumping back to the time after Christ ascended. Back in this time, the early church in the book of Acts 2, they worshiped and did different things as the early church. So they worshiped by prayer, teaching, preaching, broke bread together. They served each other. They met in homes and temples, courts, and they sent out missionaries to territories and just spent time praising God and reading letters and these things. So they did other acts of worship. And again, also in the Gospel of John, Christ talks about worship. And so Christ himself taught us how to worship. And he said in the book of John 4:23 through 24, it says, "A time is coming and now has come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and truth." And so, Christ said, worship is more than just all these things. It's an attitude. It's an attitude of our heart, our mind, and our soul, bearing that before the Lord. And so Christ showed us how prayer can be an act of worship. When he gave us the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, he prayed, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And then in the end he says, "For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen." And so he taught us how to worship. Christ taught us how to worship. But when we think about it and kind of compare it to fighters, also fighters don't go it alone, right? Each one has their role, and they're much more effective as a four-ship or a group or a multi-ship package. They're much more effective that way. And so I think as Christians, we're meant to be more effective in our worship too as groups. So, in the Bible, it also encourages you not to go it alone, not to worship alone. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, they talk about it, and he says, let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another. So there's value together as worshipers to encourage each other. And so, worship is so many things, right? I think we shouldn't put worship in a bucket. Most of all, worship is an attitude, right? It's a gift. It's a giving our minds and our hearts and our souls to God. It's worshiping, as Christ said, in spirit and in truth. So worship can be so many different things. And so I just like to encourage you as you think about worship to realize that we need and God needs for us to take a time out, to look out that window, to take a view of the best office in the world that we have to worship the Lord God in spirit and truth. And I think if we take that time, I know that if we take that time, He'll show you more than just a breathtaking view. Look forward to seeing you in chapter 7. and enjoy the debrief questions.